So if you've watched my reviews for the 2 seasons of Jurassic World Camp Cretaceous, you know that I'm a little envious of all the kids that got to have a Jurassic Park animated series when I didn't, or at least kids of the 90s didn't. But then I thought back to this and realized, yeah, maybe it was a good thing we didn't get a Jurassic Park animated series in the 90s. Hey everyone, it's Alexander the Real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel, and boy do I have a special review for you because today I'm going to be talking about the Back to the Future animated series. Don't remember it? Well, let's just dive into the review. The show actually debuted in September of 1991. It came out 1 year after Back to the Future Part 3, and just 4 months after Back to the Future The Ride opened up at Universal Studios Florida in May of 1991. Even though the show came out 1 year after the last movie, it actually takes place in 1991, so 6 years after the events of the trilogy. Doc Brown and his family have actually settled into Hill Valley. They live in 1991. Marty is now in college, and the entire series is pretty much just the time-traveling adventures that Doc, his family, and Marty get into. And it lasted for 2 seasons, and is pretty weird, and that's putting it nicely. So I absolutely love the Back to the Future trilogy. They're some of my favorite movies of all time, with the first movie being my absolute favorite movie of all time. And the animated series I actually discovered at a very weird point, because I did not watch the show when it aired. Hell, when the first season debuted, I was only 8 months old, so I couldn't have been even aware of stuff like this. So I actually first discovered the show in 2003. By this time, I had seen Back to the Future and Back to the Future Part 2, but I had not seen Back to the Future Part 3. Back in 2003, I used to watch this block of cartoons called the Fox Box, mainly because of their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, which I think is pretty awesome, at least from what I remember. It's been a while since I've seen that show. So one day, one of my old childhood friends actually came over to my house because we were actually going to head over to Universal Studios Hollywood. But before we left, right after I finished watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, this Back to the Future show comes on, and it's the first episode. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's a Back to the Future animated series? Wait a minute, Doc has a wife? He has 2 kids? What's going on? Why is this new? So I had no idea if it was new or not, because I didn't have as much access to the internet as I do today. So I just watched reruns and just took it for what it was because it was Back to the Future. But as time went on, as I got older and as I actually finished off the trilogy, I just never really gave the animated series any thought, which is ironic because I actually owned the series on DVD back when it was released with the trilogy on Blu-ray during its 30th anniversary. But again, I just never really gave it any thought. And then suddenly last year, because, you know, with quarantine there wasn't a whole lot to do, the show just came rushing back to me. I'm like, oh, wait, I remember that Back to the Future animated series. So I actually decided to watch it from beginning to end, and seeing the show as a 12-year-old boy versus seeing it as a 29-year-old man really is like night and day, because this series is not good. I'm not going to say it's god-awful or anything, but for a concept like Back to the Future, this series just really screwed the pooch on many, many levels. The biggest thing that I think this series fumbled on was the fact that it focuses mostly on Doc Brown's kids, Jules and Vern, which were only introduced to us briefly at the end of Back to the Future Part 3. And they weren't really characters. They were just there to show, hey, Doc has finally found a life. He has a wife, he has kids, and he's having a great life now. So in this series, they actually get to develop these 2 characters to the point where you really hate these brats. Jules is the oldest of the 2 kids, and he is just that obnoxious brainiac that always tries to prove that he's the smartest in the room. His dialogue sounds like it's written by somebody who doesn't understand how smart people talk, because everyone calls Marty in the series Marty, but Jules has to show that he's smarter than everyone else, so he calls Marty Martin, and it's just not good writing at all. So Jules is flat out obnoxious, but Vern is that little brother that just really loves to get on your nerves just because it's fun to egg your older brother on. And I speak from experience coming on the receiving end. But outside of just being the annoying little brother, Vern is responsible for 95% of the problems that this series endures. Almost every conflict that happens in this animated series happens because Vern screwed up. For example, he gets trapped in the Civil War and finds himself on the Confederacy side. There's an episode where Vern disrupts Benjamin Franklin's lightning test with the kite and the key because he believes that Ben Franklin is his father. And it really just results in Vern is upset about something, so he decides to go steal the DeLorean and travel back in time. And because he's just a little troublemaker, all the problems happen because of him. And you'd think after the first time he did that, in the first episode, Doc Brown would Vern-proof the DeLorean to keep him from stealing it. And he does, but only in the series finale. I'm like, wow, only now do you actually baby-proof the DeLorean from your son? Wow, Doc Brown, I'm disappointed in you. And speaking of Doc Brown, he's actually played by two people. There are live action segments in this series where he's played by Christopher Lloyd from the movies, who still does a really good job. I still love seeing Christopher Lloyd play Doc Brown. But in the actual show, he's voiced by Dan Castellaneta, who is most famous for voicing Homer Simpson. And when you hear his performance as Doc Brown, he does a decent job at doing a Christopher Lloyd impression, although there is one moment where Doc Brown goes back in time to try to teach cavemen how to create fire. I'll touch upon that a little later. There's a point where he does that, and he does the Homer Simpson, "Don't!" And that kind of took me out of the series, but that's the only time he does it. But the most annoying thing that has to be said about Doc Brown specifically is that they try to come up with several new catchphrases for him to say. Obviously, he says "Great Scott" a lot. He says "jumping gigawatts" a couple times, which, you know, he said it in the ride, and I love the ride, so I can let that slide. But hearing him say "galloping Galileos" is forced, but it's not as forced as "Ouchamagoucha," which he says almost non-stop. I get the impression that the writers and the showrunner was so convinced that this would be a brand new hit catchphrase that there's actually an episode where a younger Doc Brown hears that catchphrase for the first time, and he says, that has a nice ring to it. And I'm sitting here watching the episode going, no, Ouchamagoucha does not have a nice ring to it. It's just, no. If you talk to any Back to the Future fans who quote the series nonstop, I guarantee you that no Back to the Future fan would ever quote Ouchamagoucha. In fact, considering how obscure this show is, I'd be surprised if some people are actually aware of that catchphrase. And there are also points where Doc Brown comes across as more of an arrogant fool, because Doc Brown was energetic in the movies, but he was still a smart guy. It's just he was sometimes overly passionate about what he was working towards. He wasn't a bumbling buffoon from time to time like he is in this series. But that being said, the worst that they do with Doc Brown is nowhere near as bad as what they do with Marty Mcfly. They did Marty Mcfly dirty, and it's heartbreaking to watch because Marty Mcfly is one of my favorite movie characters of all time. He stands up for himself, he's confident, he is quick at solving problems, he's just really a great guy all around. And in this series, not only is he downgraded from a main character to a sidekick, he is a flat-out goofball from beginning to end. His jokes are cringeworthy, he's a complete idiot, and he is horny non-stop, which leads into two problems. One, the fact that he is just constantly horny throughout this entire series whenever he sees a woman makes him very, very disloyal to Jennifer. Because we know by 2015, Marty and Jennifer are going to be married. And even in the trilogy itself, Marty is still very loyal to Jennifer. And the trilogy never went down the path of will they or won't they. And in the animated series, not only do they do the cliched will they or won't they plot lines whenever Jennifer decides to pop up, but whenever Marty does something that aggravates Jennifer or disappoints her, he just continues going with it. There are points where Jennifer is humiliated and Marty will kind of make fun of her, and it just really is not the same character that we saw in the Back to the Future trilogy. And to bring things back home and give you a clear idea of how this is not the same Marty Mcfly from the movies, if this Marty Mcfly was in the first Back to the Future, he would have had sex with his mom on the spot. He would have no problem whatsoever of having romantic thoughts about his mother and possibly being his own dad. So, yeah, they did this character wrong. What they do with Doc Brown from time to time kind of disappoints me, but what they do with Marty is just straight up insulting. And another big problem with the series being focused more on Jules and Vern is that you don't get enough episodes of Doc and Marty going on time-traveling adventures. You do get some, but when you do get them, usually these two characters completely ignore all the lessons that they learned from the previous trilogy. One of the biggest examples is whenever Marty is called Chicken. If you've seen the movies, you know that Marty Mcfly hates being called Chicken. It's a plotline introduced in the second movie, but basically it results in Marty Mcfly getting into the accident that causes his hand to be broken, and it kind of just brings down his whole life in 2015. So by the time we get to Back to the Future Part 3, and he nearly gets killed for standing up to himself when he's called Chicken, he actually learns not to get so worked up whenever people call him Chicken, and it changes his future for the best, according to that letter that Jennifer was carrying the whole time. In this animated series, though, no, we completely forget the fact that Marty has learned not to get riled up when he's called Chicken, and he almost gets into trouble again with Biff's ancestor from ancient Rome. I'll touch on that aspect a little later. And as for Doc Brown, whether he goes back in time with Marty or his kids, there are plenty of moments where he clearly interferes with time travel. He prevents the extinction of the dinosaurs from happening, and there are other moments throughout this animated series where he completely forgets everything that he established himself as a rule of time travel. When you watch this animated series and see all the moments where they contradict the movies, you get the impression of whether or not the showrunners actually watched the movies or if they were actually fans to begin with. Because it really doesn't feel like it respects the source material that it's based off of. And the point that actually broke me in terms of just completely ignoring the movies is at the end of season 2, one of the very last episodes of the series, where Marty, Jules, and Vern head to 1967 and they encounter Doc Brown. Doc Brown, for some reason, does not recognize Marty Mcfly at all. And I'm like, no, you guys met in 1955. Doc Brown himself, before sending Marty to 1985, said that you've changed my life and you've given me a lot to look forward to. And then all of a sudden, in this animated series, Marty goes back to 1967, meets Doc Brown, and Doc doesn't even recognize him. And Marty makes some lame joke about he's actually Michael J. Fox. And then when he goes back to the future, Doc Brown talks about how he met somebody named Michael J. Fox. And I'm like, there are plenty of other problems with this series, but not as anger-inducing or confusing as the ones I just mentioned. Mary Steenburgen once again comes back to voice Clara, and she's the most wasted cast member in this series because Clara just doesn't really have a whole lot to do, and Mary Steenburgen's voice performance is just okay. They give Einstein a lot more to do, and they actually make him more anthropomorphic, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Some of the episode plot lines when they're not time traveling are actually really lame. There's an episode where Doc Brown's responsible for a town-wide power outage. There's an episode where Jules grows a money tree. There are a lot of episodes here that just feel flat out lazy. And most of them are from season 2. Season 2 is far worse than season 1. Although one thing that season 2 does better than season 1 are character designs. Because for some reason in the first season, there's a lot of very weird and bizarre character designs. In the episode when Doc, Marty, Jules, and Vern go to ancient Rome, the leader there, not Julius Caesar, is blue and fuzzy, which doesn't... What? They go back in time to the 19th century during Christmas time and they encounter a character who looks like a human mole hybrid. The character designs in the first season are actually very, very bizarre. But I actually want to segue into some of the good elements of the show because there are some good stuff to it. The first season actually has a handful of decent episodes. When it first started, I thought, okay, this isn't a great start to the series, but you know what? I think it has some potential. In the first season, I think there's actually quite a handful of chuckle-worthy moments. There's one moment that actually made me laugh hard. It's when Doc and his family go to medieval times. They're captured by Biff's ancestor, Lord Biffington, which that name alone I think is hilarious. But there's a point where Doc, his kids, and one of Marty's ancestors are about to be executed at a certain time, but Lord Biffington is using a sundial to determine when they're going to be executed. And he's giving this big bad guy speech, but then all of a sudden some clouds block out the sun and the sundial is just ineffective, and Lord Biffington is just like, oh great, how am I supposed to tell time with this thing when there are clouds? I forget the actual dialogue, but that moment actually made me laugh hard. Probably because Thomas F. Wilson is back voicing Biff and his ancestors. And just hearing Biff Tannen speak with an English accent is hilarious to me. And Thomas F. Wilson's actually the only voice actor in the series that sounds like he's having a lot of fun. And the fact that he gets to play many different versions of Biff, I just think is even more hilarious. The fact that there are just so many relatives of Biff Tannen and they're all bullies is a funny concept. It's like if we just found out there are so many relatives of Donald Trump throughout time. They all have the same bad hairdo. And you just have to wonder, how is this bloodline just scattered throughout time? Why are there so many relatives to the Tannen bloodline? Although I do have to say, the points when we actually see Biff Tannen himself, he's the bully Biff Tannen we see in 1955, right down to the character design. He's not the emasculated Biff Tannen from 1985. I think mainly because he's not interacting with George McFly. Because at the end of Back to the Future Part 3, they do hint that Biff seems to only act emasculated whenever he's around the McFly family. Whenever he's around anyone else, he just seems to be his regular old self. He'll call people butthead. So if we're going by that logic, I can let his attitude slide, but the character design is still a little wonky. I don't know, maybe after the events of Back to the Future the Ride, the Institute of Future Technology employees just forgot to take Biff back to 1955 and he's been stuck in the present day ever since. Now, the last thing I think that's worth mentioning about this series are the live action segments. Like I mentioned earlier in the review, Christopher Lloyd comes back to play Doc Brown, and Doc Brown in the live action segments is pretty much there to just kind of give an intro to the episode and also lead into a science experiment that kids could perform at home. And Doc Brown's lab assistant when it comes to these experiments is none other than Bill Nye the Science Guy. And for somebody who watched Bill Nye the Science Guy as a kid, I was in complete shock when I first saw Back to the Future the Animated Series and saw Bill Nye the Science Guy in it. And apparently this series actually led to him getting his own spin-off on the Disney Channel. So yeah, it's a shame that Universal didn't jump on the idea to give Bill Nye his own series. Instead, Disney decided to, but hey, oh well. The live action segments in season 1 are honestly more enjoyable than most of the episodes in the series, and definitely more than season 2. Because in season 1, most of the live action segments feel like something out of Back to the Future the Ride. They feel like segments that you would see in the queue of Back to the Future the Ride, mainly because the live action segments were directed and written by Peyton Reed, who would do Bring It On, Yes Man, Ant-Man, and Ant-Man and the Wasp. But I also didn't realize this until last year. He actually wrote Back to the Future the Ride. So I guess that's why I like the live action segments in the first season as much as I do, because they feel like something out of the ride. Right down to the point where they have the interface when the camera boots up on the ride pre-shows, and they occasionally show the please stand by photo that you saw on the ride. As for the live action segments in season 2, they're fine, but again, they're just not as interesting. Probably because in season 2, the live action segments just put Doc Brown in some setting via green screen. And it's just not as interesting, which is a shame because those live action segments were actually directed by Bob Gale, who is pretty much the god of the Back to the Future series, probably more than Robert Zemeckis himself. And also with Christopher Lloyd playing Doc Brown in these live action segments, you do have to wonder why you got him for these, but you didn't have him voice Doc in the animated series. That just doesn't make any sense. It's like in Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, where you have Hugo Weaving voicing Megatron, but you have the original voice actor Frank Welker voicing Soundwave. It just doesn't make any sense to have Christopher Lloyd come back to do the Back to the Future animated series, only to not have him voice Doc Brown in the actual cartoon. Back to the Future, the animated series, is a mess. It has some good moments here and there, but it's just a missed opportunity with a great concept like Back to the Future. The characters are not the same as they were in the movies. They disregard the movies at almost every turn. And even though the first season started off with some promise, by the time you get to the second season, it just gets worse and worse and worse. It's never anger-inducing, but I really can't recommend this at all. Just don't waste your money on it. I think the fact that the animated series exists is probably more interesting than the actual show itself. Thankfully, it's deemed non-canon because there's a lot that's very problematic with this show. And yeah, seeing how this show turned out, now that I actually watched the entire series, made me happy that we didn't get a Jurassic Park animated series in the 90s, because it probably would have suffered the same fate as the Back to the Future animated series. And there you go, that's my review for Back to the Future, the animated series. Now I want to hear what you guys think about the show if you've seen it. Leave a comment down below on your thoughts, and until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one. Hello everyone, I just wanted to thank you all for watching my review for Back to the Future, the animated series. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share me with your friends. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Go check out my Twitch channel and Patreon page, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good day and take care of yourselves.